Ladies and gentlemen, greetings to you all. Welcome to the Impact webinar Unveiling Australia's Prominent Offshore Wind Era, Current Landscape and Future Prospects in the 4 key states. My name is Molly Huang, Head of Content at Leader Associates, and it's my great honor to be your host for today's session. As the world addresses environmental challenges, Australia is boldly tapping into its abundant offshore wind potential, with 6 offshore wind zones now open for global considerations. This webinar aims to provide insights into the current market and the future potential across 4 key states, namely Victoria, New South Wales, Western Australia, and Tasmania. This webinar is part of our premier physical event, Australia Wind Energy 2024, from July the 9th to 11th in MCEC Melbourne, welcoming over 5,000 industry enthusiasts. This event offers an unparalleled opportunity to forge strategic partnerships with early confirmed speakers from the Government of Ireland, Government of Western Australia, Vicgrade, Royal Trade Council of Denmark, and many more. Here, I would also like to extend our heartfelt gratitude to our event ambassador RWE and Iberdrola, our platinum sponsors CSL and Fugro, our Regional Development Forum partner, La Trobe Valley Authority and the Pilbara Development Commission, our affiliate partner, Norwegian Energy Partners, as well as our field trip partner, Port of Hastings. Thank you so much for your support. Now, let's review our agenda. In today's session, we begin with 2 opening remark videos from Tasmania and Western Australia, gaining insights into government perspectives on offshore wind momentum in the rising states. Next, the Denmark Trade Council shares best practices from advanced markets and insights into international collaboration shaping the Australian offshore wind industry. Furthermore, Ashurst's legal team covers the Gippsland and Hunter feasibility license rounds and explores strategies for entering Western Australia and Tasmania market. Before we start, please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be shared online. We encourage active participation in the Q&A sessions following each presentation. Now, let's watch the opening remark video from the Honourable Jeremy Rockliff, Premier of the Tasmania Government.
Hello, Jeremy Rockliff, Premier of Tasmania. I'm very excited to be able to tell you about the incredible potential of Tasmania's offshore wind resource. Tasmania knows renewable energy. For more than a century, through endurance and innovation, our state has built a renewable hydroelectric energy scheme that is the envy of the world. Now, with 100% self-sufficiency in renewable electricity generation, Tasmania is by far Australia's leading renewable energy state and offers a compelling location for forward-thinking investors. Tasmania is open to investors who wish to become part of the renewable energy generation sector or achieve real sustainability targets through renewable energy use and generation. And we're also looking further to the future. We have legislated the Tasmanian Renewable Energy Target, which is a world-leading goal to double our installed renewable energy capacity by 2040. The opportunity to double our already significant renewable energy production will largely be enabled through our nationally significant project, Marinus and Battery of the Nation projects. In addition to injecting billions into our economy, creating thousands of local jobs and improving energy security, these significant infrastructure projects will provide market access and grid firming capacity for renewable energy generation opportunities. Our world-class wind resources, provided by our location in the Roaring Forties, offer a natural advantage and potential for further renewable energy production. Bass Strait has been named as one of the top options for offshore wind energy generation in the country by Australian Energy Market Organisation. Last month, Federal Minister for Energy Chris Bowen announced consultation is now open on an offshore wind zone in Bass Strait, off Tasmania's north coast. Offshore wind will be an important part of our renewable energy future, with enormous potential for not only electricity generation, but the jobs and the investment that comes with it for our future generations. The potential zone is 20 kilometres from the coast at its closest point, and over 10,000 square kilometres. This is just the starting point, with consultation to shape the final zone. Our government has been engaging with wind proponents as it supports the new industry in Australia. We've been working closely with Bowie, which is a partnership between Equinor and Nextsphere, and with Tasrex as they progress their Bass Strait projects. The Tasmanian government has signed 2 separate non-binding strategic framework of engagement between Tasrex and Equinor to further development of offshore wind energy projects in waters off Tasmania. A few weeks ago, we were also excited to announce that Sun Cable had selected Tasmania as its preferred site to develop a new advanced manufacturing facility. It will be the first of its kind in the Southern Hemisphere, and it will be the cornerstone of the offshore wind industry. This facility will be producing a connecting cable that unlocks our offshore potential. This is an enormous feat for Tasmania and confirms we have what the world wants. We welcome the opportunity to share our vision, and I encourage you to engage with the exciting opportunities and initiatives that renewable energy in Tasmania presents. Thank you.
Thank you. And next, we also have a video message from the Honourable Bill Johnston, Minister for Mines and Petroleum, Energy, Hydrogen Industry, Industrial Relations of Government of Western Australia. Please watch the video.
Hi, I'm Bill Johnston, Western Australia's Minister for Energy. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where I'm recording this, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. I acknowledge their continuing connection to the land, water and culture. In line with global decarbonisation efforts, Western Australia's energy sector is rapidly transitioning towards cleaner energy sources. The WA Labor Government is supporting this by promoting energy diversification and building industry capability in alternative renewable energy sectors. With abundant natural resources, including world-class solar and wind energy, our state is ideally placed for clean energy investment. Western Australia has excellent offshore wind resources, which has drawn considerable interest from global wind developers. Offshore wind resources located in Commonwealth waters along the state's southwest coast are adjacent to population centres and industrial hubs. They're also within easy transmission distance to Western Australia's main electricity grid. This is why the Australian Government has identified waters west of Perth and Bunbury as potential areas to develop offshore wind projects. A public consultation period will commence later this year. I welcome the Australian Government's contribution to develop an offshore wind industry here in Western Australia. Western Australia is well placed to support the development of this new important industry. We can leverage our existing local expertise in the offshore resources industry to supply a skilled workforce as well as supporting industries. The WA Government is working with the Australian Government to ensure all stakeholders' views are considered to identify the best areas for offshore wind development. This is an exciting time for the energy sector as new industries assist in the transition to a clean energy future. These new industries will offer opportunities for Western Australia and will assist in securing the state's energy future. It will also help us reach our target of net zero emissions by 2050. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoy the rest of this webinar.
Thank you. And it is evident that Tasmania and Western Australia have sent very positive signals for global investment. Now, let's turn to international insights from Mr. Ulrik Dahl, Consul General and Trade Commissioner of Trade Council of Denmark and Oceania. Mr. Ulrik, now the stage is yours.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to participate here today. And we are very happy that we can share some of the knowledge and learnings we have made here in Denmark. I have a PowerPoint presentation which I would like to use. So just a second, I'll see if I can get it up. Yeah, great. Yeah, I would like to share some knowledge and some learnings from Denmark, and just to let you know a little about what we are doing in Denmark. In Denmark, we have a very, very high security on electricity. It's 99.996%. So there's no problems, even we have a very big percentage of green energy in our transmission system. Today we have 72% of all electricity is generated from renewables, and 50% is from wind, primarily offshore wind. In Denmark, that is quite a lot, and we have a lot of turbines. But despite that, we have actually a quite big support for offshore wind and onshore wind. So 3 out of 4 Danes are actually very positive towards green transition and wind. I know in Australia right now there's a lot of discussion about should we have turbines, power lines, etc. But in Denmark, we actually think that turbines are aesthetic and beautiful, and there's a big support for that. There's of course a reason for that, and I'll come back to that later. In Denmark, we've set some quite ambitious targets for the green transition. In 2030, we want to be 100% reliant on green electricity. And in 2050, we want to be independent from fossil fuel. This is ambitious, and the reason we can achieve this is that we have set these long-term goals, and then the political situation in Denmark is very stable regarding this green transition. So both parties in the parliament are for the green transition, and it's actually legislated that we should achieve these targets. So there's nobody are kind of afraid that a new government will change any of this. Denmark started with offshore wind very early on. We had the first offshore wind park back in 1990, so more than 30 years ago. It was a quite small park. It was local developers there took the initiative, and therefore there was, of course, no complaints from local people, because it was the local people that started this. Also, at that time, the turbines were quite small, so it was, of course, also easier to understand that. We have then gradually grown the industry, and in 2010 we had almost 4 gigawatt of offshore wind and onshore wind, and today we are close to around 10 gigawatt. Most of it comes from wind, but we also have solar power. In the next 7 years, we have to grow the renewable industry quite dramatically in Denmark, from these approximately 10 gigawatt to 40 gigawatt. And that we will do by primarily making some big offshore wind parks, but also grow solar. Here you can see a map of Denmark, and back in 1980 there was not a lot of wind parks. You can see the red dots on the left-hand side, but today, when we look at Denmark, there are a lot of wind turbines on land. There's still space for more, but it's easier and it's more, it gives better meaning to establish turbines offshore, because there you can build them bigger, and also the capacity factor it's much higher. We are going for a very fast build out of our offshore wind parks, and we have 2 major projects. These 2 projects will be tendered this year, so we can have electricity before 2030, which is the goal. We have designed it in a way where we have an energy island at the left part of Denmark, in the west part of Denmark, and there it's going to generate between 6 and 10 gigawatts. You can see the picture to the left, and there is an artificial island where we have the substation, but also solar power and maybe opportunity to make green hydrogen. So that would be quite big project. We also have a project in the east part of Denmark. There we don't build an artificial island, but we use the island of Bornholm and then make some offshore wind parks, but bring all the electricity to land and do the things there. Back to the historical part. In the beginning, we had these demonstration projects, smaller projects. Then we have tenders for the bigger projects from around 2009 to up to today. And there we needed to offer some kind of investment to make the developers and to build the industry to start up this industry. Here you can see the guaranteed price which the Danish government gave for the different developers. It started around $71 per megawatt hour and grew up to $156 per megawatt hour. And then as the industry advanced, became more industrialized, etc., at the auctions, the winning bid demanded less and less money per megawatt hour to build the park. And the last one we had just before 2021, there was no subsidy whatsoever. So in Denmark, we found it important and needed and necessary to offer some support for the industry in the beginning, to build up the industry, to build up all the backbone of this. But today it's at least for the last auction, it was not needed. What is important to build the industry? Well, first and foremost, you need to have a thorough planning, a long planning period, so the industry knows what's ahead of them. Is it safe for them to build up the industry, the back infrastructure to build offshore wind turbines? There's a lot of various things you need to think about. Of course, ports, local production, training of people, etc. There are a lot of things you have to think about. So if you have a long period of time where you know, okay, this is an industry, there's not stop and go, but where you have a good plan, then it's much easier. And also you can obtain lower prices, of course. Then you need to have a model where there's a fair competition. You need competition so to obtain the best possible product and the best possible price. Then, of course, it should be transparent how things are evaluated and the procurement process. And then, of course, you should be able to get rid of the electricity. So the grid has to be in place when the project is finished. So a stable pipeline of projects and de-risking, that is the main things here. Social licensing. Well, there's a lot of discussions here in Australia right now. In Denmark, what we experienced is that originally there was not a lot of criticisms. It was small-scale projects, quite local projects with local people driving it. So that was quite easy. Later, it's been more difficult. I'm honest to say that. But we also found out that if you have a good dialogue with all the various organizations, there are stakeholders, and if you put the parks not too close to the coast, then it's also much easier to get acceptance. So the visibility, can you see the turbines? How big are they? Are they very dominant or only barely visible? And there we have developed some special tools. So at any place, could be in Australia as well, you can put on goggles and see, okay, well, if the turbine is this height, etc., then this is how much you can see. Then I think that's a good way to see how dominant will they be, or can't you see them at all? And of course, we will be pleased to share more with how to do that. Then, of course, there should be a very good interaction with the various stakeholders. It's, of course, the shipping industry, fishing organizations, recreational defense, there are a lot of stakeholders, and we need to discuss with them, listen to their needs and worries and opportunities. Also, of course, nature environment is very important. It's not only negative to have offshore structures like wind turbines. At least in Denmark, we learned that these structures are kind of artificial reefs. So actually they are creating good areas for fish to live, for mussels, etc. And even the birds are using the structures for a place to rest and to nest. So that's quite interesting. So there are, of course, some things you have to look into, but there are also some positive things that can come out of this. Then there's a noise, there's a hum on a wind turbine. That's not a problem offshore, at least not seen in Denmark. Onshore, I have heard it. It's I don't think it's very much, but there's a little hum, and people some see a problem in that if it's too close to housings. Here's a map of Denmark and the coastal areas. And as you can see, we have mapped all of the coastal areas of Denmark. Denmark is, of course, a much smaller country than Australia. And therefore, it's also much more congested in terms of where do we have opportunities to put up offshore turbines. But still, we have mapped out where there are defense areas, where there are fishing areas, where there are shipping routes, etc. And then the remainder are mapped so we can see, is it possible to develop offshore wind parks here? That is one thing. Then we have the discussion with the local community and the stakeholders to brief about, well, what are the plans? How would it look like? When will it be built, if it's being built, etc. And it takes time, but it's important to go through this process so people don't misunderstand or misinterpret what's going to happen. One thing that's important, because many times these offshore wind parks are located a little far away from the main cities. So there is actually a lot of jobs created. Some calculations have been made on if you have a 1 gigawatt offshore wind park, there will be approximately 30,000 direct jobs over the maybe 35 year period, and around 60,000 indirect jobs. There will be jobs for the actual development of the project, production of turbines, balancing of plants, and of course the actual installation, grid connection, etc. And then the operation and maintenance of the offshore wind park, that will be for 25 years, 30 years, or even more. As I said, in Denmark, we have now turbines that are more than 30 years old, and they are still operational and are extended. The lifetime of the turbines are extended. They are upgraded, and then they can work for more years. And then finally, at a time, there will be decommissioning. So it gives quite a lot of jobs also locally and for a long period of time. And the interesting thing is that there are many different types of skills. You need people to drive the boats, divers, climbers, electricians, welders, etc. So there's a lot of different skills that are needed. And that is of interest also if there are other industries that are reducing their need for skilled labor. The future in Denmark, well, now we have this tenders for 9 gigawatts. It will be announced this year, and the minimum for each bid is 1 gigawatt. There's no cap on the installed capacity, so we can do this, what we call overplanting. So if an area is for 2 gigawatts, then you can actually build more than 2 gigawatts, and then the additional power can be either sent to the grid, or you can send it to a private company, to an industry, convert it into green hydrogen or some others, and sell it. The Danish state will not give any support. We think and hope that it's enough that the price for installation and erection of the wind park can be borne by itself. And the developers has to pay a yearly concession fee to the Danish government. And further, the Danish government has asked for a 20% equity ownership. So the Danish government will own 20% of all the offshore wind parks. Regarding sustainability, we have to check a lot of things before we get started. There should be, of course, a life cycle analysis of the main components. We should make sure that all components are recyclable, including blades. It's only very recently that the industry have found ways to recycle used blades. We should have a good check of the marine environment, and we have to survey that during the project. So we're doing quite a lot to keep the things on so we have control over the park and the project. Here you can see that we have the two projects. One is the North Sea 1 to the west part of Denmark, and to the right you can see at the big map the island of Bornholm and the zones just south and southwest of Bornholm. And as I said, each area there is a cap where the Danish Energy Agency has said, well, here we expect an offer for 2 gigawatt. If people, the developer says, but we will only want to make 1.6 gigawatt in that area, then the zone will be reduced, and then some other developer would have the chance to come up and offer development of the remaining areas. So the idea is that we should have as a minimum 9 gigawatt, but maybe potentially 10, 11, 12 gigawatt from these two major zones in Denmark. Key takeaways from Denmark. As I said, we have been active erecting offshore wind turbines. Bad things, how not to do, and we would very much like to share that because Denmark is only responsible for 0.1% of the CO2 emissions. So if we should save the earth and the climate, then we need to share the knowledge, and that's also why I'm standing here and trying to give you a little insight into the Danish sector. Takeaways from Denmark. It's very important to de-risk the projects so you can attract the investments and secure a long supply chain. So a very clear target, maybe put it into the law, and a pipeline for projects. In the States, there's been stop and go, and that's been very, very difficult historically, because then they build up and then nothing happens in 2 years and cost a lot of money for the industry. So if you can make a number of projects where one comes after the other, and you can inform the industry about that, then it will be very good. I know Minister Bowen has said that the Australian government will try to work on that, maybe even work together with New Zealand on providing a long, safe number of projects so the industry can establish themselves and make the investments. Also provide planning and environmental work upfront to de-risk, so people know what are the conditions, where are we going to operate, and what are the things we have to take care of. when you build up an industry in Denmark, we needed to finance in the beginning to support, and I think that would be the same here in Australia. It's interesting that all over the world, people want to build up green energy production, especially the offshore wind industry, onshore wind industry as well, and to make it attractive to invest in Australia, you need to make some support mechanism. Then, of course, you should be able to manage the grid connection and plan it. Of course, the first offshore wind parks should be close to load centers, so there's not going to be built that much grid extra to connect to where the electricity is going to be used. And then otherwise also leave some of the decisions to the very skilled developers. They have tried it before, most of them, and instead of deciding 100% everything, then you should have leave some room to the developer to decide which way to go when you have the main frames for the project. Then, of course, as I spoke before about social licensing, it's important that you have a marine spatial plan, that the environmental planning and studies are conducted, and then, of course, the public consultations, maybe this visualization tool, or so people can see that if the turbines are 20 kilometers from shore, then they are visible, but only as some small figures in the horizon. In Denmark, we have a veto right if the wind turbines are closer to shore than 15 kilometers. You could consider something like that. And then, of course, jobs. There are many opportunities. In Denmark and in Europe, we are looking also very much on how to educate the staff for this, and there we would also like to help build up the local education and skills within the offshore wind industry. That was what I had from the beginning, but maybe there's some questions.
Thank you, Ms. Ulrik, for your very informative presentation, and certainly we see the great potential to collaborate and learn from Denmark. And while the audience are digesting the information, we also have some questions for you, if I may. So
yes,
the first question to you is back to your last slide, de-risk projects to attract investment. What do you think are the Australian regulations, policies, or incentives necessary to attract overseas investors, if you can name the top three?
The most important is to make certainty that there is a number of projects, that the project pipeline is big enough, because now we will soon get the results from Star of the South. But if it takes many years before the next projects are announced, then it will be too costly for the industry to build up, and that will increase the price for the actual turbines and for the projects. So to have a plan for 12, 15 years, a number of projects, and maybe even make it into law. So also if there should be a change of government or anything, then you are certain that this is going to happen anyway. So project pipeline, and also I think here in the beginning you need to have some incentive schemes one way or another. So because Australia is far away, not very much is produced locally in Australia. That will be possible in the future if the project portfolio is big enough, but also you need some economical incentives to get started, I think.
So may I conclude, so the key government intervention for the early stage should be the clear timeline, the clear target, and also the economic incentives.
Yeah, that's correct.
And also another question from Nicole Theo to Mr. Ulrik. I know Denmark does not have local content requirements. What was the reason for this? Are there plans to introduce this in the future as the industry matures?
That's correct, that we don't have any local content requirements, and we meet that question from all over in the world. In Denmark, we wanted to kind of start up the industry, and it's of course easier for Denmark because now we have started up the industry. We have quite a lot of both developers, OEMs, and sub-suppliers, so we have a good industry. It will come, that's for sure, but to put 40% or 60% should be local content. We've seen that from other countries, but that will slow down the acceleration and also make the projects more expensive. The industry would like to produce locally because it's cheaper. So I think that they will regulate by themselves and find ways where they can employ local staff and also have local production. So it will come without having a fixed percentage.
Yes, and also Denmark has been a large export of offshore wind experiences and technologies. What do you think the future collaborative opportunities will be for Australia and Denmark in the offshore wind industry expansion?
Well, we are already working both at federal and state level, and also with individual companies here in Australia. And as I said from the beginning, Denmark is a tiny small country, and we are only responsible for a tiny percentage of the CO2 emission. So if we should save the world, then we need to spread the knowledge. We would very much love to work at all levels with Australia. You can learn from lessons learned in Denmark, and also we have to learn from Australia within hydrogen and other areas. So it should be a two-way street. One thing where I think we need to build out both in Denmark, Europe, and Australia is the education sector, where we need skilled labor both to build and maintain the parks. And Denmark has taken an initiative. So for COP28 later this month, we will launch this new idea on how we can build up a skilled labor framework, and it can be, of course, education in Australia, in Denmark, in North America, etc. So, but more what skills are needed and what certificates are needed, etc. There, I also think we can work together.
Yes, and the last question before I let you go: what are your thoughts on the recent industry difficulties globally? Will it impact investment decision in Denmark? Will it impact investment decision-making in Australia? I mean, the micro environment, the supply chain, the inflation, etc.
Yeah. I think, as you saw on one of my slides, the price have gone down on how much incentive and on the price of kilowatt hours. After COVID-19 or during COVID-19, all prices went up on raw materials. Inflation is also generating a higher pace for workers, etc. So the prices have gone up when you look at wind turbines, offshore wind parks, etc. But it's the same if you look at other types of power plants. If it's a coal-fired power plant or some other fire plants, the price of other energy plants are also gone up. So it's the same. And I think we need to when the number of offshore turbines are increasing, the industry will be more industrialized, and that will bring down the cost of each turbine. So I think it from this level now, it will start going down again. It's been a difficult time the past 2 years for the OEM manufacturers and the sub-suppliers, because they had given fixed prices, and then suddenly all raw materials, everything went up, and they actually lost money on the orders they had, and of course they have been able, or they have been forced to increase the price on turbines, etc. But I think as from now on, the prices will not go up further. I think it will stabilize and maybe even fall. So compared to other energy sources, it's the same. And I think it's the only way we can go forward. So I think it's that's the way we need to go. And it will cost some money in the beginning, but they are well spent. And you can build an industry here in Australia as well.
Yes, so it's an optimistic attitude.
I think there's a big future also here in Australia for offshore wind, and for the actually production also of quite some parts, and backing the industry with the labor.
Yes, and thank you so much once again, Mr. Ulrik, for joining us today and with your very generous sharing.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. And now let's move on to our second chapter, Market Deep Dive, Navigating Law and Regulatory Updates for Offshore Wind in Australia. I'd like to invite on stage Mr. Jeff Lynn, leading the Ashurst legal team experts, and deliver his opening presentation, Australia Offshore Wind Market Overview, the Current State of Play. Dear Jeff, the stage is now yours.
Thanks very much, Molly. We'll just bring up the Ashurst slide pack. Thanks very much. Thanks, Sophie. I'd just like to begin the presentation today by acknowledging that I speak to you today from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and I speak to you from Melbourne. And I pay my respects to the Wurundjeri elders, past, present, and emerging. So I just wanted to start with that acknowledgement before we move on any further. Well, it's great today to be able to follow the Premier of Tasmania and the WA Minister for Energy and the Danish Consul General, Mr. Dahl. Fantastic levels of enthusiasm all around. I think you'll all agree. And great to see that the governments of Tasmania and WA are really doing the work to understand what this opportunity looks like for their states. Each of them obviously offering different competitive advantages for the development of the offshore wind industry going forward. And we'll hear a little bit more later on today, and hopefully explore through some questions the particular dynamics of those opportunities. I thought the presentation with respect to Denmark was also fascinating. In many respects, it sort of foreshadows some of the discussion that we'll have over the course of the next hour as we seek to unpack some of the challenges and the opportunities and the lessons that can be drawn both from the work that's been done in Australia to date, but also looking abroad at other markets. And I think everybody would agree that Denmark has really led the way in the development of this industry over a number of years now, and I think that governments in Australia, both at state and Commonwealth levels, would do well to pay attention to the presentation that we've just heard. So moving then just into what we'll be covering today. Well, firstly, perhaps just an introduction. So my name's Jeff Lynn. I'm a partner in the Projects and Energy Transition team here at Ashurst, and I'm based in our Melbourne office. I'm also, I should say, a proud Gippslander, and having grown up in the surrounded by the dairy farms and the green rolling hills that are synonymous with that part of the world, I must confess to feeling a little bit parochial sometimes as I sort of reflect on the role that Gippsland might play in the development of this industry. But I think it's clear, certainly from what we've heard from the Premier and the Minister, that the offshore wind opportunity is certainly not a peculiarly Victorian or Gippsland opportunity. It's one that really does stretch the breadth of the country. So I'm going to start off our presentation today by just providing some scene-setting remarks about the scale of the offshore wind opportunity in Australia and provide an introduction to the legal framework that's been developed here. I'll then hand over to my colleague Sophie Westland, who will address the next steps that successful feasibility licence applicants will need to be considering as they move forward with projects. We'll then hand off to Brie Michelle. She'll be returning to the theme of WA and Tasmania with some advice for market entrance in those jurisdictions based on the experience that our team has had working in Gippsland and the Hunter. And then following Brie, I'll be returning to chair a panel discussion where I'll be joined again by Brie and two of our international partners, David Wadham and Peter Grayson. Both David and Peter are based in our Tokyo office and have worked on offshore wind projects both in the UK market and the North Asian market, and they'll bring a fantastic perspective to what I hope will be a really rich and engaging panel discussion to round out this session. We'll just, thanks, Sophie. So I think that the starting point for understanding the offshore wind opportunity in Australia is really just to reflect for a moment on the current state of the Australian energy system. The Australian energy system remains highly dependent on fossil fuel. Approximately 65% of Australia's electricity delivered into the national electricity market is generated from fossil fuels. And whilst the Australian government has committed to achieve net zero by 2050 with an interim target of 45% reduction on 2005 levels by 2030, and has also set a renewable energy target of 82% by 2030. You can see that there is an enormous amount of work to be done to decarbonise the electricity generation sector itself. But of course, the task of achieving those emissions reduction targets is a much greater one than just replacing existing coal-fired power stations. Approximately 50% of Australia's emissions relate to the use of fossil fuels for purposes other than electricity generation. So that's the use of fossil fuels in transport and the use of natural gas for heating and cooling and industrial applications that make up a significant portion of Australia's fossil fuel related emissions. And so it's clear that to achieve a net zero outcome, it's going to be necessary to decarbonise those sectors as well, which is going to involve necessarily a substantial additional build out in Australia's renewable energy capacity that might amount to something like 2 or 3 times over the duplication of the existing fleet that exists just simply to provide electricity. Now, there will be others on this call that will no doubt be more familiar with the precise facts and figures of what that build out will involve than I am, and I certainly don't profess to to be an energy statistician, but it's certainly quite staggering amount of new generation that's going to be required, and certainly generation in the order of sort of 3 to 4 gigawatts of new renewables each year, all the way out to 2050 is likely to be required to underpin that decarbonisation. And when you reflect on the fact that that additional large-scale installed renewable capacity in recent years has been barely half of that volume, you can really appreciate that that there's an enormous increase in generation capacity required. But of course, this context provides a really enormous opportunity, and it's really in that context that I want to just turn and just say a little bit more about the particular opportunity for offshore wind in an Australian context. The Australian offshore wind industry has grown really from almost nothing to becoming a significant source of development opportunities in a very short space of time. It's really only 2 or 3 years ago that the Star of the South project was really the only game in town, and now we've got a situation where more than 30 feasibility license applications were submitted just with respect to the Gippsland offshore wind region alone, and other regions to come. So while many of the challenges that are faced by the onshore wind industry relating to questions or issues such as supply chain and access to skilled labour and approvals related matters apply just as relevantly in the offshore context, and perhaps in some cases even more pressing in the offshore context. The offshore wind industry certainly does provide an opportunity to dramatically increase the rate of development of offshore wind energy in Australia, and I think the great opportunity that the offshore wind industry provides is to accelerate the growth in the renewable energy generation sector in Australia. I think it's worth noting that the development of offshore wind enjoys bipartisan support in Australia. The Offshore Electricity Infrastructure Act was enacted by a Liberal government and is now being pursued with enthusiasm by a Labor government at the Commonwealth level. And unlike some other areas of industry policy, certainly support for offshore wind does seem to attract bipartisan support. We heard in a Danish context some of the discussion about social license issues, and I think it's fair to say that offshore wind in Australia has got off to a strong start from the perspective of social license. Now, there have been some issues raised in the context of the Hunter and the Illawarra regions in particular, but I think there's certainly hope and expectation that those issues will be resolved as the industry moves forward. And certainly in a Victorian context where it's actually the transmission as much as it is the onshore generation that's caused social license issues, the development of offshore wind really does present an opportunity to generate significant volumes of renewable energy without generating social license challenges relating to the connection of that generation to the grid. We heard from Mr. Dahl observations about the importance of generating a pipeline of projects and setting targets. And certainly it's the case that the Victorian government has led the way in an Australian context in the setting of targets, and we've seen a series of stepped targets announced by the Victorian government: 2 gigawatts by 2032, 4 gigawatts by 2035, and 9 gigawatts of installed offshore capacity by 2040. And I think it's clear that the targets are really critical to building industry confidence in the level of government support and in creating the underlying appetite and willingness to invest. And certainly in the work that we do, and all of the conversations that I've been having over the last 2 years or so with potential offshore investors into the Australian offshore wind market, a question that is routinely asked is, well, what are the targets, and what are the targets in other states, and will there be national targets, and will those targets be increased? So I think there's certainly strong interest in governments displaying confidence in the industry sufficient to set down those markers. So then just moving to reflect on the development of the regulatory framework in a little bit more detail. Underpinning the development of the Australian industry is a new legal framework that's reflected in the Offshore Energy Infrastructure Act and the regulations that have been developed under it. That Act and regulations commenced operation in July 2022. The OEI Act was largely modelled on the offshore petroleum regime, and so for lawyers and others that have been advising on that industry, there are a number of very familiar features in the offshore wind regime that's been developed. The Act and the regulations provide a process for the Minister for Energy to declare offshore wind development zones following the completion of a public consultation process in relation to those zones. Once a zone has been declared, proponents may apply for the grant of a feasibility licence. Now, feasibility licence provides holders with an exclusive right to assess the area of their licence for its suitability to develop a commercial offshore wind project. And once the feasibility assessment's been completed and environmental and other approvals have been obtained, the OEI Act provides for the grant of a commercial licence. Transmission licences are also available to connect or to provide authorisation for the laying of a transmission cable from the project area to connect into the onshore transmission grid. A first round of regulations under the OEI Act were issued in November 2022. Those regulations were designed to support the process of making applications for licences and to support the administration of the licensing regime. However, those 2022 regulations were silent on the framework for the conduct of works under a licence. And we know from the OEI Act itself that the holder of a licence, including the holder of a feasibility licence, will require one or more management plans to be in place and approved by the regulator prior to activities being carried out under that licence. Now, we're still waiting on information about the mandatory requirements for such management plans. We're expecting that detail, including much more detail about the environmental management regime that will apply to the conduct of both feasibility and commercial activities, and will be set out in those regulations. The regulations will also deal with consultation and consultation requirements with stakeholders, whether they be traditional owners or whether they be other stakeholders, will be a critical issue for project developers to consider. The consultation requirements in the OEI regulations are based on the consultation requirements in the offshore petroleum legislation, and I noted a moment ago that the offshore wind regime has been developed broadly to reflect the structure of the offshore petroleum regime. Now, those consultation requirements have recently been in the spotlight as a consequence of litigation in the oil and gas sector relating to questions about whether, in respect of a particular project, there'd been adequate consultation or not with traditional owners. And so it will be interesting to see whether there's more detail and more prescription provided to clarify precisely the type and extent of consultation and with whom is required by project proponents under the OEI regulations going forward. And it's to be hoped that these regulations are released prior to or with the announcement of the results in the Gippsland licensing round, the Gippsland feasibility rounds. So turning then just to a quick snapshot summary of the areas that have been declared or are proposed to be declared. You can see on this map there the 6 areas that have been nominated. So Hunter, Illawarra, Gippsland, the Bass region north of Tasmania, the Southern Ocean region around Portland in Victoria, and then the Bunbury-Perth region in WA. To date, only the Gippsland and the Hunter zones have been declared, with consultation having been completed or ongoing in the Illawarra, Southern Ocean and Bass Strait zones. Further details, as we heard from the WA Minister for Energy, relating to a possible Bunbury-Perth zone are awaited. A notable feature of the consultation that's been undertaken prior to the declaration of a zone has been that consultation has often led to changes in the final shape of the declared area. And there have been some instances where projects had been announced by proponents before that consultation process had, well, in some cases even begun, or at least had ended. And we saw that the final declared area excluded areas that had been proposed for a project, and either in whole or in part. And so we've seen some proponents effectively unable to proceed with a project on areas that they'd started doing work. So that really does point to the importance, particularly for new entrants, looking at zones that haven't yet been declared, to whilst it's important to be thinking about the area that you might like to develop a project, certainly some care may be required in retaining a degree of flexibility in relation to where you might locate a project until there's certainty as to the location of a zone. So in terms of where we're at in that process now, applications for the Gippsland zone closed in April 2023, so more than 6 months ago now, and the announcement of results is hotly anticipated and is expected any time now, really. Applications in the Hunter Zone closed earlier this week on the 14th of November, and so announcements are not expected. Announcements of results, they're not expected until sometime in perhaps the second quarter of 2024. And then the timeline for applications for the other zones is yet to be announced. So just then turning to the next slide. So a supportive regulatory regime may be a necessary precondition for the development of the offshore wind industry, but it's certainly not going to be a sufficient condition. And we've heard already in the context of the Denmark experience something about the elements that are required to be put in place to underpin the development of an industry. And certainly, I think experience that Ashurst have had around the world suggests that other critical enablers, and I think this is again consistent with what we've heard from the Denmark experience, other critical enablers really things like port infrastructure, transmission infrastructure, and the question of revenue support. And in respect of each of those things, we've seen in the Victorian context some action from the Victorian government. So we've seen the Victorian government announce that the Port of Hastings will be redeveloped as an offshore wind construction and assembly port. We've seen VicGrid, the new Victorian Transmission Planning and Delivery Agency, be charged with developing onshore transmission and connection infrastructure to really facilitate the smooth connection of offshore wind projects to the national electricity market. And we've seen an announcement by the Victorian government that they're designing a revenue support package of some sort. Now, we don't have the details of that just yet, but expected to be a contract for different styled approach. But more broadly, supply chain issues such as the availability of wind turbines and cable and other pieces of equipment, access to skilled personnel and specialist vessels will also present challenges to the development of the Australian industry, and those are themes that we may well return to later as part of the panel discussion. So addressing these issues will inevitably require governments to balance competing objectives. For example, the desire to maximise local content is going to need to be balanced against the cost and the industry capacity constraints that the Australian economy faces to ensure that the industry is able to achieve its maximum potential and most importantly do so at the lowest possible cost to energy consumers. So while there's been rapid progress happening on each of these fronts, there's clearly still an enormous amount of work to be done before the boards and investment committees of offshore wind project developers will be in a position to commit the billions of dollars of capital required to develop the gigawatt scale projects that have been announced. So I think there's certainly an enormous amount of work still to be done to lay the foundations upon which those investment decisions can be made. But certainly the direction of travel is a very positive one. So look, finally, just before I hand over to Sophie, I'll just note that that Australia has some of the windiest and most open coastlines in the world, and our major load centres are invariably located quite close to the coast, and so the opportunities that the offshore wind sector does present, are clear and apparent, and the task really lies for all of us that are invested in and working closely with the industry to bring that potential to fruition. So Molly, I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take any questions if there are any on that presentation, or if time doesn't permit that, happy to move to the next speaker.
Thank you, Ms. Jeff, so much for your instructive presentation. And yes, we do got some questions for you. Yes. So first, let's look at the big picture. Why Australia, and how large is the market? How would you evaluate the policy framework in Australia in comparison to the broader APAC region? We also got markets like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan. They're competing for resources, for development, for investment. Regarding the market size, currently only Victoria has clearly stated its target, a rolling target towards 9 gigawatt by 2040, while the rest of the states haven't released their target yet. So from your perspective, how large is the market?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Molly. I mean, I think the size of the market, is really, I think, reflected in some of the comments I made earlier on about the size of the decarbonisation challenge that the Australian economy faces, both in terms of the need to replace the existing coal-fired generation fleet, which still produces 65% of the electricity that's consumed in the national market, but to replace that fleet perhaps 2 more times over to provide for the decarbonisation of other sectors such as transport and other industrial applications. So I think, the opportunity for offshore wind in Australia is really a multi-gigawatt opportunity, and we can see that really reflected in the level of interest that's abounding in the Gippsland context. More than 30 applications for a feasibility license, even in the context of other jurisdictions that don't have targets announced. We've seen significant interest in developing offshore wind projects in those jurisdictions as well. So whilst it's obviously difficult to put a final and firm figure on the number of gigawatts of offshore wind that will be required, I think it's clearly a number in the tens of gigawatts ultimately to meet the likely demand that there'll be in the Australian economy for utility scale renewables of the sort delivered by offshore wind.
Thank you, Jeff. And what are your thoughts on the timeline and the planned process for implementing the offshore wind farms? Maybe just a general idea on what will happen in the market in the next few years, for example, in 2024, 2025, 2030.
Yeah, well, the Victorian government's got a 2 gigawatt by 2032 target. So clearly to meet that target, that's sort of eight to 9 years away. I think the level of interest that's been displayed in Gippsland suggests that target could be overachieved. Obviously, others on this call will have their own views on the timeline to take a project from the grant of feasibility license through to FID and then ultimately to commercial operations. But a time frame in the order of sort of 6 to 8 years to go through the permitting process, to go through the procurement process, to achieve FID and then move into construction and commissioning is probably at the sort of ambitious but realistic end of the spectrum, having regard to the range of challenges that will need to be overcome to achieve those outcomes. But obviously, getting on with things like developing port infrastructure and developing onshore transmission infrastructure and so on are critical elements of ensuring that projects can proceed and that they'll be capable of being financed as well.
And last question before handing over to Sophie. Do you anticipate the possibility of additional offshore wind zones beyond the existing 6 promotional zones?
Yeah, okay. Look, there's been nothing announced about other zones at this stage. The 6 zones that I displayed on an earlier slide are the 6 that have been indicated by governments, but there's certainly opportunities perhaps for a South Australian zone. I guess the other option is to look at expanding existing zones. So there's options for an increase in the Gippsland zone by adding another block to the west of Wilson's Promontory. We've seen the Illawarra and the Hunter zones. Certainly the Hunter zone, when it was declared, was smaller than had initially been anticipated. So in addition to creating wholly new zones, there's an opportunity potentially, if the demand requires it, to increase the size of zones that have been contemplated already.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for your answer, and I'll welcome you back in a few minutes.
Great, thank you.
And also we got one question from Dan Taylor. I will leave this to our next speaker, Ms. Sophie Westland, Senior Associate Ashurst, discussing the feasibility rounds in Victoria and Hunter. Sophie, now I give the stage to you.
Thanks, Molly. I'll just share my screen if I can. So I as Molly said, my name is Sophie Westland. I'm a senior associate in the Planning, Access and Environment team here at Ashurst, and I work closely with Jeff in Melbourne. I am going to talk to you today about the next steps for successful applicants. And I just wanted to start by sort of acknowledging that this is about sort of looking forward and about, you know, what steps or work streams that developers will be looking at after receiving a feasibility license. However, we actually don't have any successful applicants in Australia at the moment. Gippsland, as Jeff has sort of referred to, is the most advanced, and we are expecting some announcements from the government. However, those announcements will actually be more about potential overlapping applications, and that is a key feature of the regulatory framework in order for the minister to actually get to the point of offering feasibility licenses. If there is overlapping license applications, so multiple applications for the same area, there is a scheme or a process that needs to be undertaken in respect of dealing or resolving that overlap. And on the screen here, you can sort of see the key steps in respect of that process. So if an overlap exists and the applicant's submissions in respect of those overlapping areas are of equal merit, they will be invited to resubmit their application to make an adjustment to hopefully address the overlap. That is sort of the first step. Now, what might that then prompt is the applicants will be aware of who they're overlapping with, and there may be some commercial negotiations that arise in respect of that notification. However, if there is still no change to the overlap as a result of that process, and there's no real resubmitting of the application that deals with the overlap, the minister may determine that those applicants form part of what is referred to in the legislation as a financial group. And the minister will then invite financial offers from those groups for the applicants within the group, and then the minister will award the license to the highest financial offer, in effect running a bidding process. And if, you know, we get two applicants that have bid the same, then the minister will offer another opportunity to amend the bid. But if there still is no resolution of the overlap and the bids, then the minister sort of has power to make a decision. So that is a sort of key feature of the process before the licenses can be granted. Obviously, if there was no overlap, you don't need to go through that process. But given, as Jeff's referred to, the number of applicants in Gippsland and the size of the area, we are definitely anticipating that there will be at least some overlapping applications. So even in respect of Hunter, you know, Hunter is sort of the next cab off the rank in the sense that consultation has ended. There might be sort of announcements in Q2 next year. However, you know, once again, there is still this overlapping process that needs to be undertaken by the government before they can actually get to the point of offering those licenses. However, assuming that those licenses are in fact then granted, there's quite a few key work streams that developers will be looking to step through, and a lot of these developers will have had to work through and think about as part of preparing their development plan that needs to be submitted with the feasibility license application. So on the screen, you can sort of see 6 general work streams that we've identified. You know, they're not necessarily unique to offshore wind in the sense that you look at, you know, supply chain procurement strategies, revenue strategies, infrastructure, you know, they are key components of any project development. The finalising key documents with NOPTA is obviously unique to the offshore wind area. I mean, it is based on the offshore petroleum industry, but Jeff referred to these in one of his slides there. We're talking about sort of management plans and dealing with the financial security that may be required by the government in respect of those feasibility works. So they will sort of be important documents that need to be prepared and ticked off before any sort of feasibility works can commence. And then, you know, one of the other sort of work streams that developers will start to look through is sort of their approvals. So planning and environment approvals, electricity permitting approvals is sort of down the track for commercial projects, but how those approvals will look, the scope of works that will need to be included in those approvals, the concept designs, engaging consultants, getting advice. All of that is a really important work stream that will be front loaded for in order to then be able to implement the feasibility, and then still looking forward to commercial projects, because some of those approval processes will take quite a long time, and Australia is a difficult regulatory framework to navigate. And the last sort of key work stream is something that is ongoing throughout: feasibility, transmission, commercial projects, and something that will already have started for all of the offshore wind developers, which is stakeholder engagement. So, there we're looking at community, traditional owners is a particularly important one in Australia and particularly in Victoria. So I'm in my section here for the next sort of 10 minutes or so. I'm actually going to speak in a little bit more detail about the red boxes, so approvals and the state support in respect of revenue and infrastructure, and then a little bit about what stakeholder engagement is looking like, and particularly focusing on traditional owners, which is a particularly important aspect, and one the subject of sort of significant evolution in Australia at the moment. So if I turn now just firstly to approvals, I guess that the detail on this slide is sort of not necessarily the most important bit. The key thing for developers to be looking at is that approvals will span sort of 4 different phases of works, and whether those phases occur sort of in parallel or sequential is a matter for the developer. But you sort of will have approvals for your feasibility offshore, approvals for transmission offshore, transmission onshore, and you'll have to obviously look at the commercial projects. And some of the things to be really aware of, if you're not as familiar with the Australian jurisdiction, are the key features that Australia does have a state and Commonwealth set of legislation. So if you look on that first box where we talk about the approvals for feasibility in the offshore region, there's a reference to the EPBC Act self-assessment. Now, that is environmental legislation that applies in the Commonwealth waters. There may be other secondary approvals that are also required in the Commonwealth waters. However, the project is also going to span state waters, and it's also going to span state land effectively. So transmission offshore, Commonwealth legislation; transmission onshore, you're looking at what is legislation might apply in the state waters, but also in on land. So Victoria has its own electricity legislation. There's Aboriginal cultural heritage and native title legislation that will apply. There are planning and environment approvals that need to be worked through. And similarly with the commercial project. And there are efforts to streamline some of those processes. So Victoria has a bilateral agreement with the Commonwealth government under which environmental assessments for Commonwealth legislation, so for the Commonwealth waters, can be streamlined and undertaken at the same time as the environmental assessments for state legislation, so state waters and state land projects, so transmission, for example, can be streamlined. But the other key point here is that it's an evolving space. Environment is incredibly important to a lot of the governments, particularly because of the transition that needs to occur to achieve net zero. And we have a lot of clients that, particularly from international jurisdictions, that do find it difficult to navigate the Australian environmental landscape and just the legislative framework. So, if you're talking about local content, this is one of the key areas that I think a lot of developers will be looking for that Australian sort of specific expertise. Obviously, looking to learn from international where possible, but understanding the sort of Australian legislative frameworks, and particularly in the environmental space where you do have this interaction between state and federal legislation, will be, it's important to understand how it works, but it can be incredibly complicated. And so, getting good advice in this area will be really important. The other aspect that we just want to speak a little bit in more detail about is the state support. So Jeff sort of spoke about how it's having a legislation in place and a regulatory framework is incredibly important. However, it's not going to work on its own, and that state support or federal support for offshore wind is going to be critical to the success of the industry. Victoria is certainly, and whether this is a feature of Gippsland being one of the first areas announced, or Victoria has clearly prioritised offshore wind. It's got targets, as Jeff has mentioned and Molly sort of spoke about as well, but it's also made significant sort of announcements in respect of other areas. So Jeff mentioned that the government had advanced the Port of Hastings as the dedicated port for Gippsland offshore wind. And what they've announced there is that it will be, they're undertaking sort of environmental assessments, and they're looking to go through the approval process to upgrade the Port of Hastings so that it will be designed and developed to cater for offshore wind. That doesn't mean that other ports might not be, other ports may be used by developers for offshore wind, particularly if developers are finding it difficult to get the access that they want at the Port of Hastings. They might look at other private ports to cater to their needs. But certainly the environmental approvals alone will be a significant process that the government is seeking to prioritise to ensure that the Port of Hastings is up and running to assist and developers. And they've been engaging with developers about what those design and build should look like to ensure that it does in fact fit the needs of Gippsland. One of the other things that it's done, Jeff sort of mentioned that there will be revenue support and that we don't sort of necessarily know exactly what that looks like now. In the Victorian offshore wind statement number 2, which was released earlier this year, they did announce that there would be a contract for a difference auction. So they're looking to target the first competitive process for that CFD in sort of late 2024, early 2025. There has been some concerns raised from developers that actually might be a bit too early in the sense that developers will need time to cost up their project in order to properly participate in those auctions. But there is, like with all of these sort of state support initiatives, there is ongoing consultation with industry about what sort of the CFD auction should look like and potentially even and when it should be. But that certainly further design will be announced. The state government has said that they will be publishing a sort of third offshore wind statement at the end of this year. Whether that happens or whether it pushes to next year is not yet known, but certainly there'll be a lot of industry looking to see what further commitments are made in respect of CFD and other revenue support that might be provided. Transmission, Jeff did also mention this about VicGrid, and so VicGrid is sort of the body that has been empowered by the state government to augment the transmission to try to ensure that offshore wind will have an ability to effectively plug and play into the grid. As Jeff mentioned, transmission is actually a bit of a vexed issue in Victoria and in New South Wales. The social licence for transmission can be difficult to achieve. There's a lot of public objection to where the transmission goes, whose land it traverses, whether it should be over underground or overhead. The amenity concerns in terms of noise and visual is always a common concern. However, the state government is clearly prioritising getting that transmission developed and installed so that it's ready for offshore wind in the future. And the last one I just mentioned there is the streamlining of Commonwealth approvals. So I sort of spoke before about how we do have Commonwealth and state environmental approvals. At the moment, there is an ability to streamline that process. Because this legislation is based on the Offshore Petroleum legislation, they actually deal with environmental approval slightly differently. So when it gets to the EPBC Act Commonwealth approval, there is a process by which NOPSEMA, which is the sort of one of the regulators in the offshore petroleum industry, can assess the environmental assessments. And then if NOPSEMA ticks it off, then effectively you get sort of deemed approval under the EPBC Act. And that is one option that the government might consider adopting in respect of offshore wind as well. And really where that might be of great benefit is where there is significant offshore, but there really isn't as much onshore. And so the benefit of having the existing streamlined process between state and Commonwealth isn't really as necessary, whereas having a specific sort of more streamlined process in the offshore area alone might be something that the government looks at adopting. what I wanted to just end with is just to touch on traditional owner engagement. This is an area that in Australia has been the subject of significant evolution over the last 5 years, and even particularly in the last 12 months in the offshore project industry, because of some decisions that have occurred in respect of offshore petroleum. Some may be aware of the typical Lipper decision, and sort of Jeff alluded to that in terms of the impact it's having on consultation required for environmental plans in the offshore oil and gas industry. And so some of the key features about engaging with traditional owners in Australia are things like the competition for an audience from traditional owner corporations or Aboriginal corporations is really high. And if you think about a Gippsland being a concentrated area, there's one Gilwak or the Gunai-Kurnai people is the one sort of people that you most likely need to speak to. There are potentially other sort of traditional owners that might need to be consulted with as well. But, there could be 30 applications, there could be 10 projects, 5 projects that are all looking to get the attention of traditional owners. And that's just something really important to sort of keep in mind. And these Aboriginal corporations are not funded. There is some provisions in certain legislation that when you're negotiating with traditional owners, you need to fund the negotiation in the sense of, making sure that they have appropriate legal representation. That also might extend to any expertise that they need from a commercial perspective, or to understand the project or the environmental impacts. So it's really important to sort of keep that in mind, that they do need that financial support in order to be able to properly participate in the negotiation or the consultation. Getting consultation right is important. A lot of developers will have already reached out to the Gunai-Kurnai or other traditional owner councils as part of their sort of pre-consultation before the feasibility submission. It is important to give enough time. As I said, they're going to be inundated with requests for meetings, and it's important to give them the respect of their time, and to listen and learn and be able to implement what they're telling you. And what areas are particularly important, and how that should be feeding into the design of a project. Holding meetings on country, if invited, is really important. It's great relationship building. It's sort of integral to understanding their traditional owners' perspective. One of the sort of key features of the modern sort of rhetoric is the free, prior, and informed consent. You'll hear it a lot in your consultations with traditional owners in Australia. The principles speak to being transparent when you're providing information. There's a sort of public participation concept where there's sort of minimal involvement down one end, and then there's FPIC down the other end. And it's about, what do you do with the comments? Are you actually going to listen and then implement, or are you just sort of going to listen and then ignore? Like, there's a whole sort of spectrum of what involvement your project should be aiming for. And certainly traditional owners are looking to be partners in these projects. They want to help people learn about their traditions and their culture to ensure that they are being appropriately reflected in the way that the project is designed and how the environmental impacts are being assessed. The last one there is just, basic respect and recognition. That can be manifested in different ways. So in Australia, we have RAPs, or recognition action plans, where a business will sort of sit down and actually set out what they're doing to recognise traditional custom and culture. A lot of companies these days will pay for cultural awareness training that will be delivered by traditional owners to learn about the areas on which they operate. Even just down to things like, how are rooms named? How is your project named? Like, we've had companies that have named projects after shipwrecks, instead of maybe thinking about whether there's a broader cultural, thing of significant object value, place of significance that could be recognised in the way that projects can be named, rather than potentially shipwrecks or other more Anglo, I guess, historical features. Looking at how to recognise Aboriginal culture in everything you do is sort of, it's an important way to build rapport and show some authenticity in what you're doing. I'll finish on that, and I'm happy to sort of go to any questions, Molly, if there has been. I can see there's been a few pop up into the chat.
It is. We have in total 6 questions in the Q&A box for you, and we also got several from the pre-registrants.
Yeah, I'm happy if you want to just pick a couple, and then I'm happy if they get noted down, and I'm happy to sort of respond to them separately more than if just for time. I'm happy if you just want to pick a couple, and then I can respond to the others separately, like in writing if needed.
Yes, let's pick 1 from our side and also 3 from the Q&A box.
Great.
And the first question is really about the timeline. Based on the current state, what will be the roadmap for offshore wind development in Victoria, especially in the Gippsland? After the feasibility license round is granted, what will happen? The contract for difference or what?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the contract for difference is more looking at sort of 2024, 2025. There are obviously some immediate steps. So if we're looking at overlapping applications maybe being dealt with in the next sort of couple of months and feasibility licenses being granted early next year, then there are obviously some immediate steps that developers will be looking to undertake, you know, confirming the scope of works, doing your EPBC Act, self-assessment and referral, you know, reviving any sort of consultation that maybe has stagnated a little bit while the feasibility licenses have been getting assessed. And then you'll be looking at, obviously there's engagement of consultants, there's the whole sort of like on the ground things that need to happen. But then definitely things like looking at your commercial project, and whilst it might be sort of 3 or 4 years away, things like your commercial, your approvals for that project will take a number of years, as will sort of sorting out your connection. CFD will certainly be involved, and whether end of 2024 or it's more likely to be 2025, whether that's an appropriate timing, but that's certainly what the government is looking at the moment. So there's a couple of really big milestones that will need to happen. I suspect that commercial projects are more looking towards the end of 2027, 2028 in that time. But certainly keeping your eye on the prize and planning and sort of an orderly steps will be really important, because there will be a lot of challenges in the sense of navigating Australia's framework, but also the supply challenges will be significant, and getting access to the infrastructure that you need to deliver the project, I suspect will be the subject of immense competition and something that will need to be carefully managed.
Yes, there are a lot of questions around the overlapping issues. So I think we can combine 2 questions into one. In case of overlap causing a financial round, the additional time required with postpone the COD, what timeline would the government enforce to solve that round? And how do you see the private negotiations play out, taking into account competition law?
Yeah, the competition law one is a really interesting one, and I'm not really sure the government necessarily has a resolution to that at this stage. I know Jeff's been sort of involved in certain conversations around that, so certainly inviting him to jump in if he's heard anything more recent than I have. In terms of timing, though, I was actually talking to Jeff about this the other day. I mean, it sort of depends on how the government wants to play it. We obviously don't know what the timelines are. There's not necessarily statutory timelines that have to happen, but it is quite a staged, like there are quite a few steps in the overlapping process, in the sense that there's inviting the applicants to adjust their application, and the amount of time that applicants will get will also depend on how well that they can do those commercial negotiations, if possible. If you only get a month, then you've got to sharpen your pen pretty quickly. If you get a little bit longer, maybe the government's trying to make sure that the resolution happens at that stage. But given the competition issues, we're not really sure how that will play out yet. But certainly then you've still got the financial bids, and if it doesn't get resolved on that first round, then there is a possibility for a second round. And if the second round still doesn't resolve it, you know, there is a potential for the minister to make the decision. So, I mean, that could take 2 or 3 months at least if each one of those steps needs to happen. It obviously depends on a range of variables. So it's difficult to give an exact timeline, but there are a few steps to get through.
Mm-hmm. And another 2 questions about the infrastructure from Dan Taylor. What is the level of support that the Vic government is providing to Port of Hastings, and how are developers going to prioritize for access to area within the port? And also from Colin Peterson, do you imagine that the Victorian government will require these, granted projects, including the redevelopment of the port, and to undergo an EES process? Sorry.
Yes, I sort of might answer both those questions together because I think they are related. I mean, the government is providing significant priority or emphasis on getting the port redeveloped. And yes, I do think that an EES will be required, Colleen, which will be, an extensive process. I've been involved in an EES in that area. There'll be a significant level of community involvement. The Port of Hastings is quite close to a Ramsar wetland, which will no doubt give rise to a number of assessments that will be required. And so certainly there's a fair bit of work to go into the approvals that will be required for those upgrades. But the Port of Hastings will be incredibly eager to ensure that that happens efficiently, and will be liaising with the community and the government to get the sort of support that it needs, I would expect.
Thank you, Sophie, for your very enlightening address. There are 2 more questions in the Q&A box, but we don't have time to address it publicly. So I would appreciate if you can type down answers if you do have time.
Of course, I will certainly make a record of those.
And thank you, Sophie. I think it's time to welcome our next speaker, Ms. Brie Michelle, Partner Projects and Energy Transition of Ashurst, will share insights on market entry strategies to West Australia and also to Tasmania. Ms. Brie, the stage is given to you.
Thanks very much, Molly, and thank you, Sophie and Jeff. I'd also like just first off to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands where I'm presenting from, as I'm based in our Sydney office and here today. So I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. As we've already heard today, we have now got 2 very sort of key new opportunities imminently before us. So the Bass Strait area in northern Tasmania is now open for public consultation until 31 January 2024, with obviously the expectation coming out of that the area will be declared. In respect of Western Australia at this point, while we don't have the zone sort of formally open for public consultation, zone consultations are expected to commence later this month. We've heard strong messages of support today from the Honourable Jeremy Rockliff, Tasmanian Premier, and the WA Minister for Energy, the Honourable Bill Johnston. And as just a sort of an example, if we sort of move forward, the highlights and the strengths in these jurisdictions that are available to us. Starting first, in particular, obviously a key opportunity in Western Australia, like other jurisdictions in Australia, there are ambitious goals to transition away from the use of fossil fuels and in fact looking to close all coal-fired power generation by 2029. And the government of Western Australia has identified as a part of that, and in order to support future industry growth, that it's looking at a need for over 50 gigawatts of new energy to join the grid in WA. The state, clearly with its very strong history in the mining and offshore sector, has some sort of very key sort of commercial comparative advantages to other states in terms of technical expertise and experienced workforce servicing those sectors at world-class renewable energy resources, vast unpopulated areas of land, and those established energy sort of infrastructure capabilities already exporting energy and other resources internationally. The support in WA for the emerging hydrogen industry presents a great opportunity in respect of a route to market and that need to bring online the additional capacity that offshore wind energy can bring. And clearly as well in Tasmania, sort of very similar landscape. In many respects, we heard today, obviously, the really positive news of Sun Cable establishing its manufacturing hub in Tasmania and the need that will create for increased generation in Tasmania. Similarly, and more broadly, Tasmania has very ambitious plans in the hydrogen sector, which will underwrite that need for additional offshore wind capacity. The Marinus Link to be developed connecting Tasmania with mainland Australia also means that any excess power will be able to be exported to the mainland when demand outstrips supply in the NEM. So really great opportunities there. And where we sort of turn to key lessons from Gippsland and Hunter. So flip forward. Thanks very much, Sophie. Now, Jeff has already outlined one of the key issues that's been identified as the areas open up for consultation and move forward with declared areas and feasibility licence application processes has been that those areas identified for offshore wind have, through that consultation process with various stakeholders, fishing, offshore oil and gas, marine users, state local government representatives, First Nation people and local communities, that the size of those areas have been reduced, in some cases relatively significantly. The maps on the screen here show obviously the change from the original area identified for Gippsland and ultimately the area that was declared, which is still obviously a very significant area at 15,000 square kilometres. In respect of the Hunter declared area as well, an additional condition also came out of that process, which was the height restriction of 260 metres. So in terms of considering that and any applications, so obviously there are already quite a number of project proponents who have very serious plans for projects both in Tasmania and in WA, and significant work will already be occurring. What we've identified is obviously from these past processes that there will be some of that work that is effectively lost, where the area that is ultimately declared does not actually encompass the location of some of those projects. Thanks very much. Just moving on. And sort of speaking further to this uncertainty and how parties can manage it, while also trying to establish the merit of their projects and position themselves for successful award of a feasibility licence. Unlike many other jurisdictions, the Australian offshore wind regulatory framework does provide for award of feasibility licence without a financial offer process, but that is only where, one, is sort of critically that threshold merit criteria has been met and there are no overlapping applications. Two, where there are overlapping applications, but your application is more meritorious than any of the overlapping applications. In formulating the Australian regime, it's quite clear that perhaps the government hadn't anticipated quite the level of appetite for investment in Australia that is now apparent. And there's clearly a view that any overlaps might be minimal and could be resolved through that second stage of the award process where you look to the overlapping groups and parties may have an opportunity to engage in negotiations with other parties. There is obviously a fantastic objective sitting behind not jumping to an auction process, which is obviously not to burden these early stage projects in Australia with effectively a rent tax to develop their projects, which will ultimately could undermine the commercial viability of the projects and drive up the cost of energy to consumers. What does it mean, though, for project proponents? We've heard already today that it is critical that any investors, any developers in the Australian market are able to actually secure rights to a sustainable pipeline of capacity to develop. If not, they just cannot get to the scale that's required for commercial viability. So in this process where we have concurrent award consultation processes running in parallel, what it is meaning for potential applicants is that they're having to make decisions in respect of submitting further licence applications in another area before they are actually aware of the status, the success of their earlier application. We've mentioned already that the Hunter declared area application window closed yesterday. It opened and closed without any news on the Gippsland application process. And the difficulties, obviously, for applicants in this context is that in order to actually establish that satisfaction of the merit criteria, they have to be able to demonstrate that they can deliver their global portfolio of proposed projects. So if applying in the Hunter, if applying in the Bass Strait, without any confirmation of success in Gippsland, for example, they need to be able to demonstrate that they actually do have the technical, commercial, other resources available to them to successfully deliver those projects, and that will form part of that assessment. Obviously, as well, not knowing what opportunities are on the horizon, there is that point too, that future opportunities that arise may turn out to be more attractive, and that could be for a multitude of factors, whether it's the wind resource, whether it's the access to facilitative infrastructure, or whether the route to market. So, for example, obviously we've spoken quite a bit about the opportunity in the hydrogen space, both in WA and also for Tasmania and green products, and what that might mean in giving investors in these projects certainty of that route to market, and it will underpin their project going forward. The other 2 points to note here is obviously that without having closed a process as yet and seen an application through to award of a feasibility licence, it's unclear how it will unfold. So in respect of the negotiation of any overlaps, as well as any financial process, we haven't seen as yet how the government will exercise its discretion. Clearly, there have been multiple compelling submissions for feasibility licences in Gippsland. So we get to see, how will the government actually weigh up across the various merit criteria to determine a more meritorious application? What will that actually look like? We do obviously have within the OEI legislative and regulatory framework an outline of what merit criteria that you need to satisfy are. So that will apply equally to Tasmania and WA. DQ have guidelines that provide greater insight into the weighting of the criteria. However, there is still that level of subjectivity and ministerial discretion. Just in the interest of time, I won't go through the key criteria that are set out on this slide, but I understand these slides will be shared with you following the presentation, and we will pick up on a couple of these points in the subsequent slides. So just actually taking a step back for the purposes of your application. So for those who are at that stage looking at their application, particularly in anticipation in Bass Strait and further down the track in WA, these are some housekeeping points that parties need to be aware of, particularly for entrants who may be new to the Australian market and certainly new to this process in Australia. So just one on structuring. You do have to be a body corporate registered in Australia to apply. You can't have an unincorporated joint venture. Parties need to be really mindful also of the changing control provisions in the OEI Act as they move through the process beyond application, while they're waiting award, and then further along, and how they manage that at key milestones for their project. So if parties are looking to be involved earlier on and exit, say, before FID is taken in respect of a project, all that needs to be considered in advance and worked into, particularly if you're in a consortium, that needs to be worked through with the support of your advisors, and also those notification requirements. You need to be across those when you do need to inform the registrar and seek approval. The second one, funding criteria. So it is a threshold requirement that on award you have 150% of the funds required for the costs in the first year. However, setting aside a threshold requirement, the government has made it clear that you will be considered of higher merit if you can demonstrate that you have funding for all your activities available for the duration of the feasibility licence process. Another one, and a very time-consuming point that parties need to consider on entry into Australia and in respect of the process, is obviously your Foreign Investment Review Board approvals that may be required, whether or not you may have an exemption, but also looking to your consortium that you may be working with and the other members in there, and how their status may impact your need for further approvals. So, for example, if there is some foreign government investor involved, and that will just need to be worked through. And obviously these processes can take time, so it is something to be considered well in advance of your application. Moving on to some of our other sort of suggestions and learnings coming out of the earlier processes. And the first one there on the key persons, and this also goes to, your eligible person and your merit criteria, and whether you can be assessed as being able to demonstrate that you can deliver the project from a technical standpoint as well. But you will be naming key persons as part of your application and need to be alive again to notification requirements and whether any changes might impact the merit of your application. Considering Australian presence, how to demonstrate local content, all for consideration, and looking to the costs point that has been raised today, particularly around sort of supply chain issues, where you're not potentially demonstrating local content of some key elements of your supply chain, perhaps demonstrating or sort of justifying why that is and how it actually goes to your ability to deliver the project, that's the strength of the commercial viability of your project. And we will speak a little bit more just about that sort of technical capability point on the next slide. Multiple licenses, I already sort of have picked up on that theme. So where parties, and it could be either within the same declared area. So obviously in Gippsland, we're aware of parties who have applied for multiple licenses, but also those concurrent processes where you might have an application in for Gippsland, have just submitted one in the Hunter, and be looking to submit one in the subsequent in a subsequent area that is declared. And as I sort of noted, you have to be able to demonstrate, because the registrar will consider your capacity and ability to deliver those projects across those areas and globally, looking holistically at your entire portfolio. Again, there's sort of, I guess, more a technical project consideration that's set there in item 2 as well, obviously, in terms of looking at the configuration of your project and how that sits against the merit criteria and the guideline that has been set by the government, as well as in going to the planning layout of your proposed project. Sophie's already touched on state government involvement, and Jeff has also sort of talked to the CFD regime that is anticipated. Obviously, that will feed into the commercial viability of your project, as well as how you approach stakeholders in respect of your project. That has been one sort of very key item in Victoria, for example, that VicGrid is taking management of the onshore transmission piece, which goes some way to replicating some of the regimes and approaches by governments elsewhere around the world. One thing to note, obviously, is, bearing in mind the uncertainty we have in respect of any CFD option, what form it will take, any other support that may be available to projects, what it will look like from state to state, because our experience of government support in Australia has certainly been that they have been bespoke to a certain extent on a state-by-state basis, but also looking at that and how any government support may actually impact your offtake arrangements, your route to market that you may already be contemplating as part of your project submission, and just bearing that in mind upfront while you're making your plans. And then just some final points to note, some final thoughts on how you might address the technical resource, the financial capacity piece in your ability to deliver your project as part of establishing the merit of your proposal, and particularly in that context of having multiple applications in while you're trying to obtain rights for that sustainable pipeline of capacity in Australia to continue. Obviously, we're seeing a lot of investors who are partnering with consortiums and being involved with different consortiums for different applications in different areas, which obviously gives them the ability to leverage greater financial technical capabilities as well as human resources. It may also clearly assist, point two that you'll see there, where you play a different role within the consortium from application to application, will obviously enable you to present different specialists within your organisation where you are trying to demonstrate that technical ability to deliver the project on an in-house basis. Now, what is also flagged in DQ's guideline on merit is that there will be an equal treatment where parties do engage with third-party consultants and contractors as well. So that certainly does open up the ability for applicants to demonstrate they can meet some of those threshold requirements. At the end of the day, there is significant cost involved in all of this, and so there are sort of question marks about how that award process is going to unfold in the early regions. Particularly, obviously, we're awaiting news really any week now in respect of Gippsland and seeing whether the projects who have spent years building a profile, whether they do succeed in award of a licence beyond parties who have come to the market later. So thank you very much. And Molly, I will open the floor for any questions.
Yes, Bray, thank you so much for this illuminating speech. And again, we do have like a lot of questions lining in the Q&A box. And first of all, I think the most important thing for developers in Tas and West Australia is about the government support, the government wealth. So in your mind, when do you think Tasmania and West Australia will release its offshore wind strategy paper? And do you think this kind of FLA process will mimic the process in Gippsland and Hunter, or the government will improve the process?
I mean, one would hope that there is some learning that's taken from how the processes are being run in the eastern states. I understand that it is quite possible that there will be more details from the Western Australian government in coming weeks, but I think at this stage there's just not a lot of information available.
Understood, but that's why we need webinars like this to bridge the information gap. And the second question is really about a very detailed question from, I think, yes. Do we expect the same level of cutouts from the consulted area to the declared area in North Tasmania? I think it appears on one of your pages regarding the Gippsland area cuts. Do you think this kind of situation will happen in North Tasmania? And from a broader scope, how significant will the scale of opportunity in Tas and West Australia be compared to Gippsland and Hunter?
Well, maybe it's easy to start with the last question, and based on the area that's currently out for consultation for Bass Strait, obviously it is a really significant area as well, over 10,000 square kilometres. The Gippsland declared area is 15,000, but in fact the potential for generation is considerably higher for Bass Strait at 28 gigawatts compared to only 10 gigawatts for Gippsland. So we'll sort of wait to see on that. Again, for WA, information is a bit light at this stage, so I'm going to withhold comment. Obviously, there is a lot of information publicly available about potential project proponents who, as I mentioned, have sort of got started on their potential projects in WA. So the size of those projects might be considered if we're trying to size up what the declared area might end up being in WA.
And yes, sorry, please go ahead.
Yeah, and in terms of cuts, again, point to note, while Jeff mentioned obviously there's bipartisan support for offshore wind, there's definitely been, I guess, an increase in pushback by certain stakeholders. It appears that Victoria and particularly Tasmania, being so close to the Gippsland area as well, may suffer less from some of the pushback by stakeholders than what we've seen recently in New South Wales.
Mm-hmm. And one last question regarding the presentation. Do you mean in slide 21, page 2.2, that if a developer is already awarded a license, the register will ask for more justification that the developer has the capacity to work on a second license in parallel when applying for a second license? I'm not sure
Yes, no, I mean, the guidelines make it clear that that will be a consideration. And that's not just looking at applications and potential projects in Australia, but it's looking holistically at the portfolio that applicant is developing or looking to develop internationally, because it does go to the likelihood of that party being able to or proceeding with a commercial decision to proceed with those projects.
And thank you so much, Bree, for your very detailed answer. There are still some questions in the Q&A box. I would appreciate if you can type down answers. And thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you.
And finally, we move on to our last but not least topic, the panel discussion on client advice as we look ahead to 2024. Mr. Jeff Lynn, I welcome you back to stage again, and please welcome your panel colleagues.
Thanks very much, Molly. Have I got on the line Peter Grayson and David Wadham? Maybe we can...
Yeah, you've got me, Jeff.
Yep, got you, David. Fantastic. Pete there as well. Yep, g'day. Fantastic. Wonderful, Pete. Thanks, David. Good to have you both online. And I think we've got Bree with us as well. So look, thanks everybody for staying on for the panel discussion. I appreciate that we're sort of pushing up against the clock now. So I really appreciate people's time. What we've got now is an opportunity to spend some time unpacking some of the international dimension on a number of the issues that we've been facing in discussion with Peter Grayson and David Wadham in particular, who are partners in our Tokyo office. David and Peter have had the opportunity to work on a number of offshore wind projects in the UK and the North Asian markets and bring a current international perspective to the questions that we've been grappling with over the course of the last hour or so. So I'm really excited to have you both along. And so thanks, David and Peter, for making time to join us here in Australia. Look, I just wanted to start by asking you both, you've worked on offshore wind projects around the world. And you're currently based in Tokyo and so very close to that market as well. I just wonder if you could each just offer a short perspective on the current state of the global offshore wind market. We've obviously seen a number of developments, some volatility in that market in recent times. But I just wonder whether you can just make some reflections on what you're seeing.
Sure. Shall I go first, Pete?
Yeah, please, David.
I mean, I think. Thanks, Jeff. I think we're at an interesting point. I think the picture internationally is quite mixed at the moment. I think we are seeing a number of the OEMs in a bit of difficulty at the moment. That's been well documented. We're seeing general sort of construction industry inflationary price pressures coming to bear, which are pushing up tariffs. But at the same time, it seems clear to me that globally the sort of policy support for offshore wind remains strong, and equally, witness the processes in Australia at the moment. Developer appetite remains strong as well. So I think it's something of a mixed picture. I think for me the interesting point is how it's going to play out in the different markets. That is to say, I think maybe if you take somewhere like the UK that's got a well-established track record, the question is really around pricing. What's the right pricing point? And yes, there might be a slight slowdown in pipeline, but ultimately, with the track record someone like the UK has got, what you're really talking about is what is the right price under current market conditions for offshore wind. I think the question becomes a bit more fundamental when you come to emerging markets, because I think we're seeing evidence that the OEMs and developers to a certain extent, have got limited firepower. And so if you're a country that's just coming to market, you need to make sure that you're kind of in front of mind for potential developers and OEMs, and you need to make sure that the scale of opportunity for your particular country or region is a good one. And I think Australia will hopefully make some good steps in that right direction. So for me it's a two-speed thing. I think that the challenge in the current market is really for the emerging countries, because I think there is going to be a bit of a race for resource and OEM attention, and people are going to go where they think they've got the best and the biggest opportunity in the new markets.
Thanks, David. Peter, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, just to support what David's saying, really, I think, my view on it is at the moment we're seeing a number of growing pains in the industry, I think, internationally, but people forget how new the industry actually is. Even in Europe, it's still compared to oil and gas, it's still a very new industry. So it's inevitable somewhat that there are going to be some growing pains, and some of the global factors that are adding into the inflationary pressures are kind of adding into the mix of points that are affecting not just offshore wind, but the mid to long term market looks very strong in our view. I mean, you only have to look at markets like the US, the Inflation Reduction Act. Europe have introduced new legislation to kind of encourage renewable investment. Japan are recently revising their rules as well to take into account their market feedback. So, I mean, everywhere you look, yes, there are some short-term growing pains, but mid to long term, I mean, that the market looks very strong. And to David's point about emerging markets competing, I think Australia's in a great position because it can really look at perhaps some lessons learned from other regions to kind of try and avoid perhaps some problems that other emerging markets have been experiencing over the last few years.
I mean, just picking up on that theme about emerging markets and the race for resources, and I think, Peter, you make the point quite rightly that that lessons have been learnt from other markets, and I just wonder whether either you or David have got an observation about the particular policy settings that you've seen work well at the early stage of markets as they developed in other countries, and some lessons that the Australian national government as well as Australian state governments can potentially take from that.
Sure. I mean, I think from my perspective, Jeff, look, government support is needed. I don't think any meaningful offshore wind program has gotten off the ground in any jurisdiction without some degree of government support. But I think one of the key things will be picking the right form of revenue support instrument. I think that's a pretty fundamental thing. And, there's been a lot of talk in different markets between whether a feed-in tariff or a CFD is the right way to go. I think it depends on the market, but I think certainly in more established or more developed trading markets, a CFD where from a government perspective, you can strike a balance between subsidy, flexing subject to market price is the right way to go. Interestingly, looking here at the last round in Japan, that they've gone to kind of a feed-in premium model. If I'm honest, I think the jury is still out on a feed-in premium, because I think if you're looking to finance some of these larger projects, your lenders will be looking for a stability of revenue and query whether a feed-in premium gives you that. So that's one issue. And I think generally, I think governments have to know, in a sense, really what they're looking for. And if you compare like the UK with some other markets, the UK has not specified many criteria in terms of, industrial strategy, location of fabrication, etc. It's allowed the UK to drive down pricing on offshore wind to a very considerable extent. On the other hand, critics would argue that, in terms of, manufacturing, know-how, etc., the UK is perhaps lost out in terms of its industrial strategy with regard to offshore wind. So I think I would just make the point that there's always a trade-off for government between whether you prioritise price or whether you put additional constraints into your bidding process and require some degree of knowledge transfer or industrial commitment to the host nation. So those are relevant points for any government to consider.
Yeah, and I think from my side, what we're seeing globally is, what happens when governments get the risk-reward balance wrong. We are now, given the competition angle we've already spoken about, we are seeing major developers walk away from projects. There are examples in the US and in the UK, so both developed and emerging markets, where actually developers are saying, you know what, the risk-reward isn't right for us here, that the subsidy hasn't been set at the right level or doesn't take into account relief for what's going on from an inflation perspective, etc. So, I think governments need to be really careful. They are essentially competing to other markets. So that risk-reward balance is crucial, really. Designing your auction rules so they're fair and reasonable from the start is going to be fundamental.
Thanks, Pete. And David, I might just turn then just ask you a question about supply chain. So, Australia is obviously a new market opportunity, and we're geographically removed from the centres of existing manufacturing capacity. So I just wonder whether you can, make any observations about how you evaluate capacity in the global supply chain at the moment, and things for Australian projects to be mindful of in the context of that supply chain capacity.
Sure. Pete, do you want to pick this one first?
Yeah, sure. I think that the general consensus is that there is a supply chain crunch globally at the moment. I think if looking at the targets of various countries and whatnot, I think there's commentaries suggesting that a pretty significant crunch is expected in the middle of this decade, 25, 26. If things aren't improved, then we could start to see some pretty challenging supply chain issues going on there. So the message really from the industry is the need for kind of collaboration on this point. And local content, I think, is a good example. When you take into account, China's responsible for the majority of gearbox manufacturing, for example. If countries adopt really restrictive, punitive local content requirements, that is just going to compound the supply chain issue that's kind of on the horizon. So in my view, what we really need to see is some pretty innovative and collaboration between regions to help kind of manage that, and the local content requirements that reward rather than penalise bidders, I think is, in my view, is the way to go. And by that I mean if you're docking bidding points or disqualifying bidders because they're not reaching an arbitrary local content requirement, that is just going to increase supply chain issues. What if you go down the reward route that the US are looking at with tax incentives and things like that? I think that's more collaborative and will help this issue. But there clearly is a supply chain crunch on the horizon that's going to require some pretty innovative thinking and collaboration between regions.
Yeah, and I think, Jeff, that the scale of the supply chain challenge in Asia is materially different from that in Europe, right? I think, it's very open to OEMs and contractors generally to move resource around Europe quite easily, from Germany to Holland to France to the UK. I'm sure Australians regard the North Sea as a little pond, really. So, resource can be moved pretty easily. To give a case in point, when we were working on Moray East in Scotland 3 or so years ago, one of the installation vessels that was scheduled to do the installation had a spectacular crane failure in harbour in Germany. There's a great clip on YouTube actually of the crane just snapping in harbour. But and it was just at the beginning of the campaign. But in that particular instance, the sponsors were able to get another vessel from the region on site more or less on time. And that, I think, is just a good example of the sort of challenge that Australia and other places, frankly, in Asia will face, which is to say that availability of resource and supply chain and vessels or installation capacity is going to be a lot more difficult to move around Asia simply because of the geography. And I think that goes to the point again. You sort of wind back and you say, well, where people want to going to put their installation facilities or their vessel facilities, they're going to want to put them where the biggest opportunity is. And I think that comes back to, again, in the Asian context, a bit of competition between the different countries as to who can incentivize the supply chain to establish in their particular jurisdiction, so that you can deal with these very practical issues you're going to face on construction.
And I think what's really key to that is sort of clarity and certainty on pipeline, because when we talk to clients and developers at the various conferences and on projects, one of the biggest frustrations is around, you have all these fantastic targets out there, but there's a lack of clarity about the actual projects and space that will be available to for the project development. So if there's a real long clarity on the projects that will be available and the gigawatts that be available, that will give the supply chain confidence that they can actually invest quite heavily at an early stage of the market. If they haven't got that certainty, they will start to pull out, they will start to pause and look at other opportunities. And we're certainly seeing that in the Asia market, for example.
Just want to turn and bring you into this discussion now, Bree. We've just sort of touched on in the last part of that discussion issues around the construction of projects, and just like bearing in mind your expertise as a projects lawyer, having worked in Australia and in other markets around the world, particularly on your experience on onshore wind farms and the models that have been developed around the contracting of those, and if you could just reflect on the way that offshore wind projects have typically been contracted, and the way in which you might see offshore wind being contracted in the Australian market going forward. And then David and Peter, interested in your views on that question about contracting models as well.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jeff. No, I think it really sort of goes to the point that the Australian market for delivery of renewable energy projects until very recently, I guess, almost walked its own path in many respects. And I think it is likely because global renewable markets have sort of moved faster. There's been significant, multi-gigawatts, hundreds of gigawatts of renewable energy projects developed all over the world, and parties have got comfortable with technology risk, with construction risk to a greater extent. And the projects internationally have now for over a decade really been delivered quite often on a disaggregated multi-contract structure, and there's a great deal of comfort around that. We've only really seen that in the Australian market in the last few years. So from an offshore perspective, I think I worked on the delivery of one wind farm that was delivered under an EPC wrap, and that was a unique project in that it was being directly procured by government. So they were procuring the delivery in that case by Vestas of a project, but that has tended to be the structure in Australia. That is changing, and we're certainly not at the point at the moment of delivering projects on as disaggregated multi-contract model as the offshore wind sector has been delivered overseas. Sometimes with sort of 10 to 13 key contracts for the delivery. I think, setting aside that we haven't seen it yet, I think the Australian market will follow the overseas practice simply by virtue of the fact that the parties developing these projects will develop them the way they have developed them offshore, and that a lot of the key contractors are obviously going to follow them into the market in Australia where they're not already established here. So I think we will see those trends continue in the Australian market. There will be financing coming from offshore that will support that. It will be underwritten by ECA and other sort of international lending structures. And I'll defer to sort of comments by Pete and others, but I don't think we're going to sort of continue on that sort of more wrapped model because the participants in the market just don't tend to deliver projects in that way.
David, Peter, we've only got a couple of minutes left, so I might just ask you to make some brief comments in relation to that contracting piece, and then I'll need to hand back to Molly. And I think we might still have time for one or two questions, perhaps from the audience. But if you can keep it brief, please.
Pete and I could talk about this all day, so we will try and keep it brief. No, look, I think it is interesting. I'm becoming increasingly aware through stuff I'm doing in Western Australia or on the way Australia approaches things. We're seeing variants in Asia that we can talk to. It's not multi-contract. A lot of the projects in Asia are partial multi-contract, but ultimately I kind of agree with Bree that to some extent I would imagine that projects will disaggregate in Australia. Doesn't have to be 12 packages, doesn't have to even be 6 packages. It could be something else, but because it comes back fundamentally for me to the value point, which is to say a wrap is expensive, and if construction prices are going up, then one of the ways in which you can seek to mitigate the cost increases is by disaggregating your procurement and allocating risk accordingly. So I think we will see it. I mean, Pete, I guess you say similar sort of views.
Yeah, similar. Just because of time, all I would say is we've been wheeling out seminars on this to a number of clients across the region. So please do get in touch if you'd like a detailed walkthrough, because we spend a lot of our time actually discussing the issues and ways to mitigate disaggregated contractual structures with our clients. It's what we do day in, day out. We're very experienced in it, so please do reach out if you'd like more detail, or even a detailed seminar on the topic.
And Jeff, just one final thought on that. That's to say, from a bankability perspective, which is obviously critical. I think just highlighting the role of the LTA, because ultimately, if you've got a disaggregated procurement of however many contracts, your lenders at the end of the day are going to turn around to your LTA and say, look, taking a top-down analysis, how much time contingency is built into the project, how much cost contingency is built into the project. And really that disaggregated procurement drives a top-down approach where lenders will look at time and cost contingency, and that becomes the fundamental mitigant.
Great, thanks, David, Pete, and Bree for those comments. Molly, hopefully I've kept to your timetable here, so I'll hand back to you and leave it for you to determine whether we've got time for any questions from the audience.
Thank you so much, Jeff, and to their panel colleagues, thank you so much for this great panel discussion. I think I can see around 12 questions lining in the Q&A box. It's really difficult for me to pick any of it, and it would be too cruel for others who didn't have the opportunity to get their questions being answered. So I would suggest that we compile all these questions and share with the Ashurst team for you to decide whether you want to answer these questions or you want to get in touch with these question raisers. Is that okay?
You look, absolutely happy to take those questions on notice. If there are any particular questions that people want to pursue a conversation with any of the panelists in relation to, then very happy for people to reach out to us directly, and certainly very happy to look at those questions offline. Molly, thank you.
Thank you. As much as I'd love you to talk, now we come to the end of our webinar. Once again, I want to express my profound gratitude to our esteemed speakers and the Ashurst team for your generous sharing. A sincere thank you also extends to our valued audience for participating in today's Impact webinar. The video and the presentation slides today will be shared on our website and LinkedIn next Monday. For further inquiries, please feel free to contact me at molly@leaderassociates.com. Furthermore, I want to remind you that today's webinar serves as a virtual preview of our in-person event, Australia Wind Energy 2024. This event is scheduled to be held from July the 9th to 11th at MCEC Melbourne. We encourage you to secure your stand and be a part of this remarkable occasion. We eagerly anticipate the opportunity to meet you in person and engage in fruitful discussions. And now, see you next time and take care. This is the end of our today's Impact webinar. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, David. Thank you, Peter, for contributing to the panel discussion.
Our pleasure, Molly. Thank you very much. Thanks to all.